How's that? So our clinical research in the heart group, we have a lot of clinical trials. I wanted to talk a little bit about clinical trials because it's really essential to the way we practice. And interestingly, Arnold Patz, who died actually very recently, published one of the most important clinical trials back in the 1950s. And I'll tell you the story because it's instructive. And the setting is this. Back in the 1940s, when the antibiotics became available initially, a lot of newborns who had previously died from infectious diseases in the intensive care unit, in the neonatal units, survived their initial infection, went on to suffer respiratory consequences, and there was a very high mortality rate due to respiratory insufficiency in these newborns, these premature newborns. At the same time, in the mid-1940s, supplemental oxygen became available to hospitals, and incubators were developed where you could deliver oxygen, high FiO2, high percentage of oxygen to these infants. And it was thought that this was a really good thing because you could take a baby which was blue and you could give them oxygen and it'd be pink. And everybody thinks a pink baby is better than a blue baby. In 1942, the first case of retrolenteral fibroplasia was discovered. And what that is a exuberant growth of blood vessels in the back of the eye, in the retina. That was the first case described in 1942. By 1951, it was the most common cause of blindness in newborn infants. It was an epidemic. And nobody could figure out why it is this had happened. It hadn't been described before 1942, and now all of a sudden it's the most common cause of blindness in children. And in fact, one of my childhood friends was blind from this disease. Well, there had been a study published in Australia at 3 hospitals, and one was a private hospital which had a lot of money. A second one was sort of in between private and public, and the third one was a public hospital which didn't have very much money. And what the researchers in Australia noted is that the private hospitals had a very high incidence of retrolenteral fibroplasia, what they call vasculopathy of the newborn. And the public hospital had a very low incidence. And one of the differences in the 2 hospitals was the availability of supplemental oxygen. It was very expensive at the time. And the public hospital didn't have very much of it, and the private hospital did. So Arnold Patz, who was at Hopkins at the time, had this novel idea, this heretical idea, that perhaps this retrolenteral fibroplasia had something to do with supplemental oxygen. And maybe it had the delivery of supplemental oxygen to newborns just because they looked blue. Maybe that wasn't a good idea. So he submitted a research trial to the National Institute of Health. It was turned down. In fact, it was turned down 3 different times. And they said, you're crazy. You know, there's no way not giving oxygen to these newborn infants who are blue. There's no way this could be a bad thing. The 3rd time, though, it went through, and he was allowed to do a limited trial at Hopkins, and it started in 1951. And there was so much bias within his institution that the children who were enrolled in his trial actually didn't get low-flow oxygen. And the trial was high-intensity oxygen, low-intensity oxygen. When he would go home in the afternoon, all the nurses would turn the oxygen up because everybody knew that supplemental oxygen was good. The kids were pink. But nonetheless, even despite that contamination of his trial, what he proved and what we know today is that supplemental oxygen, high-intensity supplemental oxygen to newborn children causes retrolenteral fibroplasia and this vasculopathy in the retina of the newborn, the most common cause of blindness at the time, and now it's very rare as a result of this clinical work. So our research in the heart group is based upon clinical, and this is some pictures of that, but I won't bore you with that. Our research in the heart group is based upon clinical trials. We do a lot of clinical trials. This is not even the complete list of our ongoing trials. Virtually all of them are sponsored by a device or a drug company. Maybe half a dozen are National Institute of Health sponsored. Those of us, my particular research interest is in heart failure. Dr. Worley does a lot of research in electrophysiology, same with Dr. Goen, and then a smattering of other things. I was going to talk about our heart failure research just a little bit. Just for the people who aren't physicians in the room, heart failure basically is a syndrome that results from any structural or functional cardiac disorder that impairs the ability of the ventricle to fill with blood. Now, usually we think about systolic heart failure, which means the heart doesn't squeeze as well as it should, but there's also a concept called diastolic heart failure where the heart doesn't relax. And the two couldn't be more different. It's a big problem. There are over 500,000 new cases of heart failure each year. The death rate from heart failure, if you're diagnosed with heart failure, admitted to the hospital, your 3-year mortality is 50%. It's worse than any malignancy that you can think of. Your readmission rate to the hospital is 20% within 30 days. It's the leading cause of hospital discharges in the United States, leading cause of hospitalization in the elderly, and it is the single largest expense for Medicare. And let me give you an idea how bad that is. This is just the mortality I was talking about. It's the cost of the Medicare budget is over $25 billion per year. It is a tremendous healthcare problem, and as Tom was talking about earlier, if we can't solve these kinds of problems, the medical system is doomed. It's a real challenge for Lancaster General and for all hospitals, because as of January 1st in 2011, hospitals will no longer be paid for readmissions within 30 days. Well, I've told you that 20% of patients with heart failure, the national average, 20% of patients with heart failure will be admitted within 30 days. That's the number today. If we can't change that, the hospitals are going to suffer tremendously, besides the burden to the patients. Most patients who get admitted with heart failure, it's heart failure that we know they had. It's the exacerbation of a chronic disease. So this is not like a myocardial infarction where a patient walks off the street and has crushing chest pain, and up until that moment he'd been healthy. That's not the case. Most of the patients who have heart failure admitted to the hospital, we know they have heart failure. And had we been smarter in the way we monitor these patients, perhaps we could have prevented that readmission to the hospital. And so it's an opportunity for us, and this is what we have seen. It's a tremendous opportunity that if we can improve our monitoring, perhaps we can make a dent in this otherwise terrible disease process. So the work that we've done involves impedance measurements, and basically many heart failure patients have devices, what we call resynchronization devices. It doesn't need to be resyncing. This may just be an ICD for the physicians in the room. But they have devices that we can program to measure the impedance across the circuit. The circuit happens to be from the can, the defibrillator can, which is usually implanted in the left pectoral region, and the lead in the heart. And so you create an electrical field, and you can measure the current, and the current across this field is proportional to the resistance, or what we say in biology, it's impedance. And so as the impedance falls, as the system gets wetter, as the lungs get wetter, your impedance falls, and that, in fact, is a way to monitor patients with heart failure, because it gives you about a 15 to 20-day warning that this patient's about to decompensate. And this is the algorithm that's been developed, which I won't spend any time on, other than to tell you that this is the way it's represented. And we can see in patients who we are following in the hospital or in the office or indeed at home, we can track these changes in impedance. We can monitor it. We can download these devices automatically over the internet and actually get very frequent updates up to every 2 weeks on patients at home with these devices, telling us whether or not they are beginning to retain fluid. It's tremendously powerful. It's an example of really telemedicine, because the patient's at home, he's not coming to the office, and we call the patient and say, hey, how you feeling? There's a marker here that things aren't right. This is how the information is displayed. The impedance is over on the right. There's a lot of other information that we can download from these devices. It's done automatically. The patients have these transmit wirelessly to a transmitter, which is hooked up to their computer or their telephone, automatically transmits the information to our office. So this is an example. It's an 86-year-old man who has an ischemic cardiomyopathy. His ejection fraction, the amount of blood his heart ejects with each beat, is about half of what it should be. He's got diabetes and a few other things. He has a routine CareLink monitor. This system is called CareLink. It's made by Medtronic. And we notice on this routine monitor that he's crossed his threshold. He's got that impedance which is falling. It's a warning sign. So we call him. We say, hey, how you doing? Well, it turns out he missed a bunch of his diuretics. They'd been discontinued for a week. He didn't call us, but in fact, he was short of breath. He's short of breath, and he's swelling, and he's gained weight. I'm going to tell you that this is a patient, if you don't interact, now he's going to be in the hospital, I guarantee it. And so the point is, we call the patient, we say, listen, we think there's something wrong. Oh, yeah, you're right. I am short of breath, and my feet are swollen. He's 86 years old. A lot of these people don't get it. And so it's an opportunity for us to intervene and prevent what otherwise would have been a hospitalization.